I have that it's about 5 minutes after, so I think we should go ahead and get started, folks. Again, thank you so much for being here. I will just confirm for you that we will, wherever we are in our learning community conversation today, we will conclude at 12 noon sharp, just so you know that that will be our hard stop. Here we are back for Cultural Competence, a Journey to Improved Outcomes, Part 2. And that overarching guideline that we discussed the first time about the language, the words we choose to use. Of course, we want to prioritize people, respect, and hope. Our funder, again, asks us to make the same disclaimer that what we talk about in our learning community today, what the content that I share with you may not necessarily reflect their official views. And as you know, this 4-hour course is material that was drawn from an 18-hour course that Oasis worked with an organization named CCSI to develop and then offer. Today, we will talk about power and privilege. We'll also talk some about oppression. We'll start back a little bit with implicit bias as well. There were just a couple of other things I wanted to share about implicit bias. We'll touch again on trauma-informed care through a cultural competence lens, and we'll start to wrap things up with anti-oppressive practices. And then all of us as members of this learning community will go forward with our own journey toward cultural competence. So those additional disclaimers, no one is going to be stamped culturally competent after this conversation. This is part of our journey. It's not the end point. As we said earlier, and as it'll say in the next slide too, there will be unfinished business. There'll probably be things that you want to look into more deeply, that you'd like to find out more information about. And the idea that when I am making I statements and talking about my experience or my understanding about something, similar to when you're doing the same thing, those are our individual truths. And that's what we believe, what we feel, what we know. So again, we want to offer each other respect in regard to that. And again, these similar guidelines, we want to be listening to each other and certainly respecting our differences. This is a place where we can have a dialogue. We don't necessarily have to agree. That's not the goal. And just that reminder again of speaking from the I. We want to respect each other's confidentiality. What we talk about here stays here. You're free to leave here and certainly, and I encourage you to talk about what you experienced, what you thought, what you took away. But of course, you're not free to disclose what anybody else shared and talked about. Again, as we talk about these topics, it's natural that feelings may come up about this, and please be honest about that. Please, to the degree that you feel comfortable, share your feelings about what's coming up. And when you do that, if you could keep in mind that we want to keep our learning community safe. So please, if feelings come up or if something is triggered, please share it in a way that is positive and respectful to the whole learning community. And again, that safety word of ouch, if somebody feels an ouch, you're more than welcome to type it in the chat. You're more than welcome to say it, and we can pause and sort of reflect on that particular area. Again, we want to keep this a safe space. So no racism, no sexism, no ableism, no ageism, no sizeism, no xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, or fat phobia. And again, no hate within this particular space. And hopefully there was some fun in our last conversation, and hopefully there will be some more fun and certainly energy around our conversation, our part 2 conversation today. So if you haven't done so yet, please go ahead and type your name in the chat. again, we want to make sure that everybody gets credit for being here. So before we go back into implicit bias, wonderful, thanks, Janelle. Before we go back into implicit or unconscious bias, I just wanted to give a moment to ask if anybody had any thoughts or any reflections about part one of our conversation. And again, there's no right or wrong here. It's just if you had any thoughts or any reflections about our conversation in part one, or if anything felt sort of unresolved or unsettled where you had particular questions about. So I'll open the floor. You're more than welcome to unmute, or you can type that in the chat. But any thoughts, any reactions from our last time together?
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah, thank you, Juanita. Thanks.
So
Juanita's going to kick us off.
Right.
So hopefully
So
somebody will follow Juanita if there is something. Go ahead.
I had an epiphany, right? So initially when you asked me about the cultural competency, I was saying in my head the two didn't go together. But then it hit me with competency. Later on, it hit me. It's like knowing, just that word popped up for me, knowing, right? And I was like, okay, so maybe they do go together, because I had to think about it. And I always reflect on things I say later on, and then wish I could go back and re-explain it, right? So cultural meant difference, right? And then competency for me meant knowing. So knowing the different cultures and how to engage and better understand each one, each culture, because we all come from different cultures. And that's what came up for me afterwards. Just, yeah, I was like, okay, I got it.
Okay.
So I have something.
Thank you, Juanita. Yeah, go ahead, Pamela.
And I was discussing it with my staff also after the meeting. I was just thinking, we had a conversation about others sort of guessing, making an assumption on somebody's background or race, that they may be African American or Puerto Rican or whatever. I was just thinking that I've done that before, and I've seen others do that before. And is that really sort of a bias? Because when I think of bias, I think of a prejudice. Sometimes it's not, I could just look at somebody and say, oh, based on their skin color or the texture of their hair, but it's not meant to be a prejudice. A lot of people are very beautiful. So it's just like guessing what nationality they are.
And I will underline that, I think you said it when you said you're guessing.
Yeah.
And I will connect that to what Juanita said. Guessing is different than knowing. And in order to really engage with somebody, in order to really connect with somebody, as providers, we need to know who they are. We need to sort of know where they're coming from. And Pamela, I think that you're acknowledging something that probably many of us do unconsciously and consciously as well. And again, with cultural competence and that journey toward it, we want to know that we may lean toward doing that, but we really do need to distinguish between the difference between a guess and actually knowing from that particular person.
So I would definitely agree with you that we would have to know working in our field, but I'm thinking more on the lines that if I'm outside, if I'm moving around, if I'm in a shopping mall and I see someone very beautiful, I might just guess at what type of background, what nationality this person is, but not like a prejudice, not like a bad thing. Actually, in my head, I could be thinking this is a very beautiful person.
Sure. And you're also pointing out too, Pamela, that biases aren't always negative, but they still are biases, and they may or may not be based on the reality of the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. Thanks so much. Any other thoughts, folks, that sort of stuck out to you, or that you kind of thought about after our part one? Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Along the same note, in regards to not making any assumptions, do you advise building into your conversations with people in the beginning that you inquire as to how they identify themselves culturally, racially, and stuff like that?
Yeah, it can be very helpful to include that. And, you know, I can imagine if you were to say to somebody, you know, oh, tell me a little bit about your cultural background, or I'd like to understand you. It could potentially be a way to more deeply engage them. Thoughts or reactions to that, Eric?
I just, for some reason, I think it would be a little awkward, but I guess there's a way at developing skill in doing that, because, you know, not everybody, I don't know, not everybody might be open to such a question, or they may think, shouldn't it be obvious by looking at me?
Well, let's play that out for a minute, because if I said to Eric, you know, Eric, tell me a little bit about your cultural background, and Eric kind of comes back at me with, well, isn't it obvious? Can't you tell what my cultural background is? What might my response be? How do you think I could respond to Eric?
I don't want to make any generalizations. I want to hear it from you, because it's most important coming from you.
Yeah. And my guess may be wrong, which is, again, I need to understand and know about who you are. Yeah. And Asia types in, I can assume, but I may be wrong. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Eric. Any other thoughts, reactions, reflections from part one? Is culture this? Dolene is asking, is culture the same as race? What do you think about that, folks? Is culture the same as race?
I would say, hi, this is Janelle.
Hi, Janelle. A lot of people are typing in no, and Eric is typing in depends. But go ahead, Janelle. What's your thought?
I would say no, it is not, because prime example, my culture is I'm Trinidadian, but I'm in America and I'm a Black American. The first thing somebody's going to say, how is she's Black American? But then I have this whole other culture that is different from the Black American culture.
So Janelle, could I ask you a follow-up question?
Yes.
So when you identify yourself, let's leave what people label you aside for a moment. But when you identify yourself, how do you identify yourself?
I'm a Trinidadian American.
Okay. And again, I let Janelle tell me how she identifies. And it doesn't mean that I might not be making some assumption, but I'm still going to ask Janelle, and I'm going to go with how she identifies. Because the experience of a Trinidadian American is probably very different than an American who identifies as Black and grew up in the South. That experience may be vastly culturally different. Is that fair to say, Janelle?
Yes, that.
Yeah. Dolena, you agree with that?
Yes, because I wouldn't see Janelle as a Black American. I would see her as a Caribbean American from Trinidad.
Exactly.
Yes, because Black Americans, like you said, the culture and the experience of the Black person is vastly different.
Yeah, and we really, thank you. I think you've kind of answered your own question. We really want to understand the unique cultural experience of that person. And their race can certainly be part of that. Race is part of culture, but it's just a piece. Culture comprises much larger sort of elements. Other thoughts? Any other thoughts or reflections?
Thank you. Thank
Well,
you.
oh, you're welcome, Dolina. Thank you. Thanks for posing the question. It's a great one. Any other thoughts? Any other reflections from last time? Julianne, anything jump out at you from last time? No? Okay. Christina, anything in particular from last time? No? Okay. I'm getting very good at reading lips. No. Excellent. Okay. Culture is more a way of life. Yes, Michael. And Michael, I don't know if you can unmute. Can you say a little more about that? I'm not sure if Michael can unmute. It seems not. So maybe he'll elaborate in the chat. Okay. So again, remember that wheel that I showed you earlier, that culture is composed of all those different sort of elements. And before we jump back into, I think Tatiana's at the beach. How wonderful is that? Tatiana, if you can, type in the chat and let us know what beach you're at. That would be great. I just wanted to check in before we move back into implicit bias. Robert, if it's okay, could I ask you a question?
Sure, go ahead.
So based on our conversation last time, any thoughts or any reflections specifically about implicit or unconscious bias?
There are tons of implicit biases that can occur, and it could be just based on body language, could be based on looks. And while we may not necessarily express it, whether it be physically or verbally, we know they're bouncing around in our heads in some shape or form. It's just how do we control those,
right,
and not allow them to come out.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's just review a couple of additional things in regard to specifically implicit or unconscious bias. So, talking about implicit or unconscious bias in our learning community conversation is raising our awareness about it. And really, it's helping us learn about ourselves and learn about each other. And I think one of the things to really keep in mind, and Robert, I think you alluded to this, is that it's pretty unavoidable. We all naturally have biases. And, sort of a trend with biases is that those biases kind of are generally aimed at or against folks who are unlike us. And we have a tendency to favor people that are more like us. And a lot of the time, and again, Robert, you did touch on this, a lot of the time, and you talked about, all these biases bouncing around in our heads and probably in our hearts as well, but that we often don't have insight into our own biases. So again, we have to acknowledge that we have them, and we can develop insight, but unless we're actively focusing in that particular direction, we may not have insight into our biases. Probably one of the key things to really consider about biases and the acting out of biases is this idea of emotional or cognitive load. If you're in a highly stressful situation, or you have a lot going through your mind at a particular time, remember these biases kind of are snap decisions, instantaneous decisions that we may make, or beliefs that we may hold at that particular moment. And again, they do affect our behavior. We act them out in subtle and unintentional ways. And that really reminds me of what I was saying last time about how we can have particular values and beliefs, and our unconscious biases unexamined can really cause us to interact in ways that are contrary to our values and our beliefs. And you might experience dissonance, like, well, why did I just do that? And that can be a good thing, because that's an opportunity for you to look a little deeper, to examine. Every single one of us in this learning community has biases, and that does not make us bad people. And again, they can be part of our ongoing journey and our ongoing process of growth and self-assessment. And I think the other thing, and sometimes this is a little bit challenging to accept, is that they cannot really be eliminated, but they can be managed. And I believe, you know, Robert, I think you even used the word managed in what you were saying. So some of the strategies to manage those particular biases, or bias in particular, is certainly to recognize and become aware that we all have our own. And again, they're based on our life, they're based on how we were brought up, they're based on where we were brought up, they were based on what has been around us or what messages we're getting. Somebody mentioned the media the other day contributes consciously and unconsciously to biases that we may hold. So again, knowing that we have them and being open to doing the work to become aware of them. We can also use the power of logic, meaning when you find yourself feeling a particular way toward a particular person or a particular group of people, you can ask yourself, or making an assumption about that person, you can ask yourself, how many people do I actually know that sort of conform to what I'm thinking about this particular person? And the thing I'd like to underline there is the idea of people you actually know. And I'll link that to what we were talking about earlier. There's a big difference between guessing and knowing somebody. You can also hit the pause button. You can realize, oh, I'm in a stressful situation right now, or I've got a lot on my mind right now, and I need to not make a decision right here, and I need to reflect on what that decision may be. We can also choose to focus on creating common ground. What do I have in common with this person or this group of people? One of the things when I do trainings on LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex people, when I do trainings on that, one of the common ground points that I note for everybody in the training is that everybody has a sex at birth, everybody has a gender identity, and everybody has a sexual orientation. And that's common ground. Everybody has those things and has some place on the continuum in regard to those. So we can intentionally choose to look for common ground. And again, we can always strive to be fair and recognize when we recognize our biases. Okay, I have this particular bias. How can I be fair in this particular situation? And being aware of your own motives for changing. And again, being realistic. Remember, you can't get rid of your biases, but you can manage them. And you can prevent projecting your own biases or beliefs on other people. So you'll notice that these are all numbered 1 through 6. And I'm going to ask you, and again, perhaps this is inviting you to choose which one would stand out to you most, but I'm going to ask you to type in the chat the number of the one of these 1 through 6. And we have a little over 51 people joining us in this conversation today, which is wonderful. Glad to see, I think everybody came back, which is wonderful. But what I'm going to ask you to do is type in the chat which one of these kind of jumps out at you most. Which one of these jumps out at you most? And go ahead and just type that in the chat. Okay, excellent. Okay. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to just, and hopefully we can hear, everybody will type in the chat. And I'm noticing that some people are, putting two of them because one is not enough, and that's fine. Perfectly okay. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And again, thank you, folks. If you haven't responded yet, which one of these kind of stands out to you most? And I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for just a moment, because I'd like to ask a couple of people to unmute and say a little bit about why the one that they identified stood out to them most. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this particular moment. Hopefully everybody got a chance to type in the chat the one that stood out to them. And Paris, if you don't mind, if you would be willing to unmute, could you say a little bit about which one stood out to you most?
In regards to common ground, I think I put common ground. I think seeking that is always trying to find the most important of what relates to each. The common denominators I like to use,
Okay. So common ground, because then that way it's something that you can connect with the other person about.
Absolutely, and you can generate any conversation once you find any type of common ground, whether it's sports, whether it's social issues. It doesn't matter what it is. If you find a common ground, you can pretty much express conversation from there.
Super. Thanks so much, Paris. Wendy, any thoughts about? Can you elaborate a little bit about the one you chose?
I chose hit pause and self-reflect because I have found that sometimes you unwittingly react to something that's said or something you see or just any kind of interaction. And I think sometimes you just need to hit that pause button and think, why am I reacting the way I am? Is it them? Is it me? Is it my own background? What is it that's making me do that? So I think hitting pause and self-reflecting is critical.
Yeah, thank you. And you didn't use this word, Wendy, but I'm wondering if this is part of it, the idea of also being curious about your own sort of reaction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And being willing to explore that.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Wendy. Rashana, nice to see you. Good morning. Which one did you choose?
So I was just allowed to get in. My computer has been updating since like 10 o'clock. So I'm just now getting in. No.
All right, well, welcome. Glad you're here. Please type your name in the chat. Want to
Okay,
make
thank
sure
you.
that you get credit.
Okay.
Janelle, any thoughts about the one that you picked?
I picked common ground. And I should have picked more.
Well, you can do all of them, but yeah, go ahead.
But I picked common ground because just for the fact that I'm in a different culture than mine, I want to make sure that I'm understanding the people around me. One of the things I did coming to a new site, I actually sat with my staff individually one-on-one and asked, tell me something about yourself. I left it as an open question. They could have started at something professional, something personal, or anything, right? And a lot of the information that I got was about their culture. And it was not my culture, but I was able to learn like, okay, so we have these things in common. So I will be able to reach out to my staff, on this level, or have a better understanding of them on this level. So, finding the common ground is why, in that angle.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Janelle. And, I see your hand, Eric. We'll come to you in just a second. I want to underline something that Janelle said, because I think it's part of the spirit of that journey toward cultural competence, is that you have the willingness and the desire to find common ground. Because keep in mind, folks, there are some people who want to look for what separates them from other people, not what they have in common with other people. So Janelle, you really inspired me to want to underline that, because what I heard from what you said was that you really are open to the idea and want to find that common ground. You have the willingness, you have the desire to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
With all the numbers in the chat, it didn't allow you to see a comment that I think would be good for you to address.
Oh,
If-
sure. What was it?
Scroll up to the one just before the numbers start from Michael Stokes and see what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Okay. Michael Stokes says, I disagree. I am not biased. I grew up with neighborhoods from different parts of the world, Jamaica, Trinidadian, Jewish, Haitian, and Blacks. I played with them all. So from a young age, I was exposed to different nationalities. People are people to me. Excellent. Michael, can you unmute and say a little more about that? And what I'm getting a sense of, that you disagree that you have any biases. Let's see. I'm not sure if Michael can unmute. Yep. Michael says, no, sorry, no biases. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And again, Michael, I can't speak for your experience. I'll keep the focus on myself. I am convinced 100% that I have conscious and unconscious biases. And if I'm going to work in cross-cultural situations, that those are things that I want to raise my awareness about. So thank you for sharing your experience, your multicultural, multiracial experience in terms of how you were brought up. Yeah, Shelley wrote in, we can do harm if we don't identify our biases, even in professional settings. Absolutely. Yes, and Dolina is asking, are biases also stereotypes? And they can be. And Tatiana's in Montego Bay. Excellent. All right, let's go forward. Eric, did you want to comment on that? Did that stood out to you for a particular reason too? So did you want to comment on that?
I disagreed with it.
Okay.
Because I think bias, and particularly implicit bias, is just a natural thing that occurs because of human narcissism. However, I found it more interesting, and the reason I prompted you to address the question is because I wanted to see how you handled it. And you handled it in such a way as, even if you disagreed, you didn't make your disagreement known. You explained what your bias and the fact that you have them, and that's the only way that you can address them. So you were reaffirming, and you weren't at all, condescending or demeaning in having a different point of view.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, Michael is sharing his particular perspective, and that is welcome here within our learning community. And Michael added something else, as did Alberto. Michael added, if we were all the same, what kind of world would it be? Boring. True, Michael. And that's where diversity and multiculturalism can be such a powerful thing, because it adds so much. Alberto writes, I think biases were useful to our ancestors so they could make decisions quickly, which helped them thrive in their environment. Yes, and that is the essence of what biases are. They're often these unconscious, quick decisions about the people or the surroundings around us. And again, they are impacted by a lot of different things. Asia types in, let me read what Asia typed. Asia types in, being biased does not necessarily have to be about race or class. Absolutely, Asia, you can be biased about a lot of things. It can be about the way someone answers a question that may offend someone else. Michael types in, being different, we are able to share and learn things from others. Yes, and again, I believe as Michael types that, he's typing an I statement. Being different, I can share and learn things from others. What I will throw out for us to consider is, sometimes because of people's conscious or unconscious biases, they cannot learn things from other people. They don't want to learn things from other people. And I think the biggest example of that we can sort of focus on in this particular country is really the presence and the persistence of racism and discrimination. That is a perspective that somebody does not want to learn from somebody else, does not want to be open to that particular person's cultural experience. And Christina writes in, being biased does not have to be it. That is very true, Christina. Not all biases are negative. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And again, I see that we have now, Michael types in, of course, people think their way is best. Yeah, and Michael, thank you, because that is actually a bias. As a person, if you think your way is best, or if you think your values are best, you're potentially sort of being biased against somebody else's values or their beliefs or their culture. So absolutely. And I think that that's an inevitability, that people would think their way is best. Cultural competence is really inviting you, and I can kind of boil it down to this, I think, that cultural competence is really asking all of us to consider that our way, our experience is our way and our experience. It's no more than that. It's no less than that. And my experience may be very different than Robert's experience. And I can be open to wanting to learn about Robert's experience. But that has to be, and I want to go back to what Janelle said, that has to be a conscious choice, folks. I have to consciously say, I'm going to do the work to be open to somebody else's experience or culture. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Very, very rich discussion. And let me just quickly check the chat again, because I think Tejan wrote in, whether positive or negative, such cognitive shortcuts can result in prejudgments that lead to rash decisions or discriminatory practices. Yes, Tejan, I agree with you 100%. And so does Asia. Exactly, and it can be improved upon. I agree, Asia. And that's what this whole conversation, the reason we're spending this 4 hours together, is so that we can move toward improving upon that and what we bring to it. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody who chimed in on that. Really very rich and part of our learning community experience. So now let's talk about power and privilege. And, again, I want to thank people for really sharing their particular perspectives, because I know that a lot of folks have particular perspectives on this word privilege. And, many people push against this word. Well, I don't have privileges. And I'm going to give an example of a privilege that I've become aware of that I have. And I will pause the screen for a minute. And this is the privilege that I've become aware of that I have. I have found that when I am driving my car and I see a police officer, or I'm pulled over by a police officer for speeding or whatever, I'm not worried that I could get shot. It never even crosses my mind. I never even consider the fact that I'm in danger. Now, I underline that as a privilege because I never thought about that before, until I started doing this particular work and started finding out that men and women with Black and brown skin have a very different experience when they're behind the wheel. And and again, I'll underline, that's a privilege that I know that I have. And again, I'm going to ask you, yeah, and Asia types in, what about incarceration rates? Because again, that's another indication of structural racism within the justice system. Because Black and brown people are incarcerated at much higher rates with much worse sentences than white folks. So folks, what affords me that privilege that I acknowledged? How come I have that privilege? How come I was unaware of that privilege? And I'm going to invite somebody to unmute. Go ahead, Roshana, go ahead.
I stated that it's your skin complexion.
Okay. And my skin complexion is?
More on the lighter side, pale.
Yeah.
I don't want to say it.
You don't want to say it. Okay.
I don't, not like that. I don't want to, I guess like, I don't want to sound like I'm like judging you or whatever, but yeah, like pale.
Okay. All right. And thank you for being thoughtful in regard to that. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the kindness behind that.
Right.
What I will say though, and tell me if you agree with this, Roshana, and if other people agree, is that the culture, the society as a whole, sees me as a white man.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say. And then I can also say that you didn't give yourself the privilege. And most people that look like you, that feel like you don't feel like they gave themselves the privilege. They were just born with it. So it's very unfortunate that you kind of get the heat for it, if that makes sense, or you get looked at differently. You didn't ask to have this privilege. You were like literally born with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely true. And I think the other thing to consider in regard to that is that if I continue, or if I was to continue to not acknowledge my privilege, I would be contributing to structural racism.
Yes.
So part of my work is really focusing on what is my power, what is my privilege, and how can I share that? How can I own that? So it's not a privilege anymore. Because one of the things about privilege, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but one of the things about privilege is that part of the way privilege works is the privileged person or class is not supposed to know they have a privilege. It's just the way it is. So just as an intro into that, and I see that a number of people put some things in the chat, so I don't want to miss them. Erica typed in, because you are white. My experience is different from my husband when my husband is behind the wheel. And I'm going to presume that your husband is not white. He's Black or brown, or somewhere within that continuum. You never had to worry both because of your skin color and maybe because of where you grew up. Very, very astutely observed. I believe you was unaware because the revolution is being televised. That's very true, Dolina. I am also impacted by all the coverage about the changes that are going on. Also from leadership of the government, absolutely. Again, that's kind of the power piece. Zakia, because you never experienced it as a child or as an adult, so you never had to think about it. History, how this country was built, absolutely. Eric, it's important to behave in anti-racist ways, absolutely, and anti-oppressive ways. Asia, You are already doing some of the work, being here and speaking to us with an open mind and realizing this is not your fault, but also acknowledging it. And Erica types in, he is white. Okay. Yeah, your husband is white, Erica. Thank you. Oh, he is white. Okay. Erica, I don't know if you can unmute. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah,
You,
so
go ahead,
that's
Erica.
okay. We totally different. I'm Black, he's white.
Okay.
And we live in Georgia, so it's the South. He's from up north, and his experiences behind the wheel is totally different from mine.
Right.
Like when I'm behind the wheel, I'm on alert that, you know, if I see a cop, I kind of tense up.
Yep.
Where he can do something that I would probably never do because I'm scared I'm going to get pulled over.
Yeah.
So even though we've been together 20 years, sometimes even with our relationship,
yeah,
he can't understand why I'm so the way I am and upset. Like, for instance, I did get a ticket recently and I pulled over in a lidded area. I was afraid. And I tried to explain that to him and he quite did not understand what I was. He's like, well, I would have said that, but that's you. They would treat you differently than they would me. So even in my own home, we do have two different experiences.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks. And again, I want to underline a couple of things that Erica said, because it really made me think of social determinants of health. Because Erica said, you know, I tense up. And when I was pulled over, I was afraid. So keep in mind, imagine that repeated multiple times in somebody's life. And imagine what that may do to their health and how that may impact their health or may impact how they manage the stress that they're under. Okay. So just, Erica, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. And the other thing that really jumped out to me is that how difficult it is for Erica's husband to really wrap his head around her experience. And I would throw out, because I probably have shared her husband's reaction, is because I personally haven't had that experience. And that means that I have to work harder, be more open to understand what somebody else's experience is and validate that experience. Erica tenses up. She was afraid when she was pulled over. That was her experience. Yes, and Rashana types, it's hard when it doesn't happen to you. Absolutely. It may be hard, but it's not impossible. Asia writes in, and again, not his fault, but the divide between differences is real. Yes, it is. It absolutely is, Asia. Thank you. Thank you. So oftentimes, and I think that we've kind of alluded to this, but oftentimes what can be perceived as the American norm, I'm going to show this to you. And what I'm going to ask you to do is use the chat to just type your reaction to this American norm. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you. You'll see it. And just whatever reaction or whatever feeling it brings up for you, just type it in the chat. And remember, we're talking about power and privilege. Okay. And there's power in even using the word norm. So just keeping that in mind. So I'm going to show you this. It's not going to be a surprise. And go ahead and just type in the chat what your thought or your reaction is to the framing of this American norm. So I see that somebody has already typed in the chat. It's bias. I agree, Michael. Wow, Rashana says. Juanita says implicit bias. Julianne says not really. Giovanna says not surprising. Eric says it's the unfortunate truth. Mozella says it's true. Peter says interesting. Wendy says sad but true. Erica says biased, but kind of true. Tess, jarring. Rebecca, true. Jessica, biased. Tijan, I'm not surprised. Asia, It's the American norm, but this does not exist in my norm. Thank you. And thanks for making that distinction, Eddie. It's true to some extent. Alberto, privilege of the majority. Yes. Which, interestingly enough that you say that, Alberto, because very soon that American norm is not going to be the majority. And again, I want us to make sure we're keeping that linked to power and privilege. Christina, I'm not surprised. Latanya, interesting. Natasha, this is definitely what has been communicated in the media. Absolutely. That, Dolina, that was what, but it is not so much now. Okay, so maybe more in the past. Tatiana says the 1%, and Robert says, has been this way for years, but you make your own norm. Yeah, thank you, Robert. Yes, it is changing, but still a denial to society, especially in America. Hopefully it will get better. Yes, agreed, Erica. All right, so let's go forward a little bit here. Again, this idea of power, and as we talk about this, I want you to think about your own power. Okay, how much power you, if that's the American norm, quote unquote, and again, we have our own sort of reactions and thoughts to that. If that's the American norm, where do you feel you fall sort of in the scale of power? And again, power as the ability to impose your will on others, even if they don't want it that way, and to decide what resources they'll have access to. So again, thinking about where are you in that particular power sort of breakdown. Asia types in, based on my bank account, I have very little power when it comes to power. And again, you're talking about from a socioeconomic perspective. And of course, that plays a role within our culture. Yes, Natasha says, I think we are starting to see more diverse representation in advertisement. Yes, absolutely. All right, so again, this idea of privilege, keeping in mind, it's an unearned right. Because I was born with the skin that I have, I got a whole set of privileges that I didn't earn, that they're not based on merit, that they simply have to do with the color of my skin. And keeping in mind that it can be very hard for people who have privileges, to acknowledge that they have privileges and not understand that other people don't have privileges. Again, the idea of it's difficult to wrap their head around somebody else's experience. Yeah, Juanita says she loves the obstacles. That's pretty accurate. Yeah, and again, I'm glad you're looking at the image too, because notice it's the same distance, but the journey for the woman who's got the ball and chain on her foot is going to be very different than the guy across from her. She has a much different path than the gentleman there. All right, so I see that a couple of other people, picture is real. The presentation of people in this image is interesting. Judge Jackson is going through the same thing right now in the Senate. Yes, Eric, very, very connecting it to what's going on at this particular point. So the journey is different for Judge Jackson. Yes. All right. So folks, I'd like us to engage in a little activity about privilege. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can focus on this. But I want you to keep in mind that this will be a little bit tricky because not everybody has their cameras on, but that's okay. If you would have been able to turn your camera off, just make a note of it. Every time you're able to turn your camera off, just make a little tick mark, because you want to be able to count how many times you were able to turn your camera off. Okay. And if your camera's not on and you can't, oh, Dolina, leave your camera on if you can, that would be great. But if not, that's okay. But if you can, if you can't turn your camera on, just note down every time you could. Wonderful, Mozilla, wonderful. Just note down every time you couldn't turn your camera off. Julianne says, does that mean we don't do anything, hold on, anything with our cameras during this activity? No, what it means is I'm going to ask a question. And if you can answer that question affirmatively, you would basically just stop your video. And you would make a little tick mark that you were able to turn your camera off. Okay. And then I'll say, turn your cameras back on, and then you turn your camera back on. Julianne, does that make sense? Got it? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good, good, good. Okay. Yes. Yvonne just typed in power corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yes. Oh, you know, before we do this activity, I'll throw out one other thing, which is that I was thinking historically of a really powerful example of privilege that was so unconscious. And this may not even be a true story, but it's a great example. Do folks know who Marie Antoinette was? And you may remember she had her head cut off. So during the French Revolution. So advisors and people came to her and said, you know, Your Majesty, yes, let them eat cake. Your Majesty, you know, people don't have any bread to eat and they're starving. And her answer was, well, let them eat cake. Because she had cake, she assumed they had cake. It was hard, it was difficult for her to even wrap her head around the fact that somebody wasn't leading the privileged life that she was leading as a French aristocrat. So again, just keeping in mind how privilege is intended to be unobserved or unconscious. You're not supposed to know you have it. Okay, so here's the activity. And again, you just turn, and I'll play too. So you turn your camera off when you can. And just keep count of how many times you turn your camera off. All right, here is question number 1. Okay, if you never were called names because of your race, class, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, turn your camera off. So if you were never called names because of your race, class, gender, or sexual orientation, turn your camera off. Okay, excellent. And if you were able to turn your camera off, just make a little tick mark. You can turn your cameras back on. Question number 2. If your ancestors were not forced to come to the USA and came by choice, turn your camera off. Okay, you can turn your cameras back on. Okay, third question. If you were never ashamed or embarrassed of your clothes, house, car, or other things, turn your camera off. If you were never ashamed or embarrassed of your clothes, house, car, or other things, turn your camera off. Okay, you can turn your cameras back on. And I like how some people are keeping connected to it in the chat. If you studied the culture of your ancestors in elementary school, turn your camera off. And you can go ahead and turn your cameras back on. Okay, next question. If you were encouraged to attend college by your parents, turn your camera off.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
I sure can, Tatiana. If you were encouraged to attend college by your parents, turn your camera off. Okay, make a note of it if you turned your camera off. Excellent. Just a couple of more questions, folks. Next question. If you do not have a disability, turn your camera off.
That disability could be physical, mental, or health-wise?
Yes, could be anything. Yep. 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 So if you do not have a disability, turn your camera off. Okay. Make a note of it if you turned your camera off. Turn your cameras back on. If you were not raised in a single parent household, turn your camera off. Okay, turn your cameras back on. And just a few more, I think 2 more questions. No, actually just a couple more. Okay, we'll do 10. If you ever inherited money or property, turn your camera off. If you ever inherited money or property, turn your camera off. Okay. Yeah. Giovanna, my camera's on too. All right. And the last question, well, actually, yeah, there are just 3 more, so we'll do all 3. If your family owned the house where you grew up, turn your camera off. Okay. Turn your cameras back on. Okay, next question. And then there's only one other question after this. If the majority of the leaders in your community are the same race as you, turn your camera off. Okay, you can turn your cameras back on. Fantastic. And the last question. If the majority of the leaders in your organization are the same race as you, turn your camera off. Okay. So you can turn your cameras back on. Excellent. Wonderful. So what I'd like everybody to do at this particular point is just type in the chat how many times you turned your camera off or could turn your camera off. And remember, there were 12 questions. Yeah, excellent. Okay. Excellent. Good. Thank you so much, everybody. So given that we're engaged in this conversation about power and privilege, what do you take away from that very basic, very simple activity? What do you take away from that? We all have different experiences, and I am privileged that most of us have 50% or less privilege. Yeah. Wonderful. People are writing in a lot of different things. It was an eye-opener to me, to Erica. Jasmine says, it made me think about my upbringing. Juanita, I'm not as bad off as I thought. Okay. Christina typed in, I am not privileged. The disparities, even within this small gathering, is saddening. Thank you, Tess. The power or privilege is subjective. I don't consider myself privileged, although I scored a 6. Zakia, can you say a little more about that? I think you're able to unmute.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so although I scored a 6, the questions that I were able to turn my camera off, I didn't see it as being significant or a significant part of my life that created privilege or made me privileged. For instance, you asked if I was ashamed of where I grew up and my stuff. I even if I didn't, I wouldn't know that I didn't, because I grew up in the Caribbean, Trinidad. Most of the people around me, that was what they had. So I were neither ashamed or embarrassed by it, because everyone owned or had what I had. So but I didn't have a lot. So I wouldn't consider myself privileged. A lot of the questions you asked, I were able to turn my camera off, but I didn't see that as a part of my life that made me privileged, or like my parents encouraged me to go to college. They did that because they didn't go, so they wanted me to go so that I can have a better lifestyle. So it can be very subjective.
It's absolutely subjective. Yeah.
So that's why I said I don't consider myself. I had to work really hard just to get here. So without help, without financial help, without anything. So although I was 50%, I still wasn't privileged.
Yeah. Thank you, Zakia. Thanks for elaborating on that. And I see that a couple of other people wrote some things in the chat. Rhonda wrote in, I turned it off twice. I almost didn't share until I saw how many twos. We are not all that different. Michael, some of us are privileged and don't realize it. Absolutely. Julianne, you sent this to just me, but I think
mean to.
Yeah. Is it okay if I read it out loud?
Yeah, it was supposed to go to everyone.
That I thought so. I'm really glad the way you did it. The people who had less identified privilege were visible, because that is opposite of how our society operates. Yeah, Julianne, can you say a little more about that? Because I agree with you 100%, and I think that's why the activity is structured that way. Would you like to elaborate on that at all?
Sure. It's like how people were talking about with that norm thing of, that the norm is like white male. And even though that's not reality, that's what we see in media. And also with talking about kind of how privilege is blind, right? When we talk about stories like what it's safety with driving and that kind of thing, when people talk about that, often their voices are silenced because that's not the kind of stories that the media picks up.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's not what I really appreciate that, because what you're talking about is how that the privileged are usually always the visible ones, and people who aren't privileged are made invisible or erased. Yeah. Thank you, Julianne. Thanks so much. Thank you. Somebody, there was one other thing I wanted to, Tatiana, you mentioned it has caused some growing pains. I'm wondering if you can unmute, if there's anything you'd like to elaborate on that.
I know that I have been told in the past, because of my name not sounding ethnic compared to some of my friends whose last names have been Rivera, Sanchez, they say, my name is Tatiana, it's Russian. My last name is Salas, which is very common in my country, but in this country it's not. And it doesn't sound supposedly what an ethnic last name is supposed to sound, Latino last name. So, and then, I didn't grow up in, low echo time in Mount Vernon with some friends, and I did an illegal U-turn. And I was listening to one of the ladies that was saying, the story about that. And the police officer came up to me and he was like, that was an illegal U-turn. And, I smiled, I was like, okay. And he was like, just be careful next time. And the same thing in Park Slope. But my friends that were with me was like, if that was me driving, that would be a whole different ballgame. You benefit from privilege because you're not dark. And then my best friend is dark skinned. And she's always like, you go, they like you better. And I'm like, girl, stop it, right? And yet I look at myself and I live in Howard Beach. Those people in Howard Beach don't look at me like I am the same as them. So it's interesting what, growing up is just, and even now as an adult, it's like people tell you you have this, but then other people look at you and you don't have that.
Right.
So it's finding that balance. So yeah, it causes those growing pains because you're like, you know, which way do I go? So I just keep forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for elaborating on that. Julianne typed in the chat colorism. And again, that whole idea, and that can happen within a group as well as outside a group, but the idea that sort of lightness of skin, darkness of skin, and again, back to that American norm, which is where supposedly all the power and the privilege is. So what I'd like to share with you at this particular point, and Tatiana actually made a great segue into this, is I have a little video that I'd like to share with you about structural racism. And I'd like you to just take a look at this particular video, and then we'll talk about it going forward. And if you've seen this video before, go ahead and just type in the chat that why, that you've seen it before. It certainly is worth watching again, but you may not have seen it before.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So had anybody seen the video before? I don't know if anybody typed in the chat that they had. Nope, I'm not. Nope. Nope, somebody had. Yeah. So thoughts, reactions to that video? Belinda had not seen it. Okay, thanks for letting me know, Belinda. Yeah. Juanita, any thoughts? You wrote very accurate. Any thoughts, any reactions?
So yeah, I mean, when as it was going, the first thought that popped in my head before they said it was redlining, and then they said it. So I was like, you know, it's true. It's an unfortunate truth, but it's true.
Yeah. Thank you.
Unfortunately, it's still nothing much has changed.
Yeah. Yeah. And
it's a shame that, you know, depending on the zip code you live, or I know, and I'll tell you a personal story for me. Last year when I was thinking about buying a house and I was talking to a realtor, and she was trying to guide me to Long Island, right? And I remember an expose on, I think it was Eyewitness News, about how realtors in Long Island were gearing or pushing Black people to live in this particular area and white folks to live in another area. And I said to her, the one thing I don't want, if I chose to go with you and start looking at houses, is for you to take me in the all Black area. I want to go in an area where it's mixed. I don't want a predominantly white, and I don't want a predominantly Black area. My preference is a mixed area. And she didn't work with me, which made me feel like, you know, my thoughts about her were accurate, right? So just from her telling me the area she was talking to go, the area that she wanted to take me to was all Black. And only because I had seen the story on Eyewitness News,
right,
was I knowledgeable about the practices and was able to say to her, no, well, you're not going to do that to me.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
And had you not seen the story,
right, I would have been like, okay, sure, let's go.
right, right. And you wouldn't have known.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Goes back to knowing.
Yeah. Thank you, Juanita. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
I just want to acknowledge some of what was written in the chat. Mozella, right? What's there to say? It's the same. Yeah, and that's the sort of sad down part of this idea of structural racism or systemic racism. Roshana writes, the name part is very true. Jessica, this is true. People of color have had to work twice as hard to get half of what white people already have. And again, this whole idea of intergenerational wealth as well. Julianne writes in, a lot of people I know, for example, my family members who are white, do not know these things. And a lot of people don't believe it because it wasn't taught in school. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And again, really interesting point, because consider, why wasn't it taught in school? Alberto writes, there may not be as much redlining today, but there is still very much discrimination today. Yes. Asia writes, just to state, I realized this year and last year during February, Black History Month, that more days of school have been taking off. Plus, they did not even teach about the regular Black leaders per usual. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. Just my observation. Plus, it is the shortest month of the year. This may be just my child's school, I don't know. And Delina writes, I am a Black American and I'm very knowledgeable about my history. Unfortunately, I was always taught that I would have to work twice as hard if I wanted anything in life. Yes. Thank you so much, Delina. Thank you, everybody. Oh, Christina writes, my introduction to my history started with slavery. Thank you, Christina. So folks, as we start to move toward concluding this part of our conversation, again, this idea of power and privilege is that depending on the cultural groups you belong to, your experience of power and privilege, and again, your examples are far more interesting than the slides, but this idea of that society, often people with the most privilege have the most power, and that makes sense. And this last bullet I really appreciate because it's the idea that power and privilege, it affects us individually, it affects our organizations, and it affects our clients. So for me, the real take home of this is that when you're sitting across from somebody, part of the journey to cultural competence is thinking about what is their experience of power and privilege, what is your experience of power and privilege, and how can you share power in your role as the provider. Janelle typed in the chat, I got upset watching the video. Janelle, would you like to unmute? Would you like to comment on that? Because certainly we can. Yeah, go ahead.
It sparked some anger in me to know that you know, in this day and age, that this is a reality of what is going on still. And you know, let's talk about biasness. This is why people act a certain way when they are educated about what is being done to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they have a reaction to the injustice or the discrimination of it. Makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Tejan writes that social justice is important because it gives us the opportunity to celebrate and learn from each other's diverse experiences and perspectives, builds a strong campus community, and impacts our daily lives. Social justice has the power to reform and improve access and quality of education, healthcare, criminal justice, and more. Yes. Yes, and again, what a great way to also sort of further describe privilege, like you're just born into something and it's given to you. And the experience of other folks is that they have to work, as some people said, twice and maybe more than twice as hard in order to get maybe some of that privilege, not even the whole thing. And other folks are born into it, like myself. And again, my work on my journey toward cultural competence is to keep that in the forefront of my mind and work to understand somebody else's experience. So we're going to focus a little bit, and again, we're just touching on the idea of oppression, which again, I think that video, I think what we've talked about really gets at this. But again, the idea of using one's power to disempower somebody else, contrary to social justice, which is about acknowledging that you have power and sharing that power, as was said by our colleague as well. And the only other thing I'd like to touch on here is the idea of intersectionality, which is you can think about differing forms of oppression. So let's say sexism, racism, ageism, those are all specific forms of oppression that somebody may feel. And if somebody has all of those particular categories that are interacting with each other, it increases their degree of oppression. So this idea of intersectionality. So someone may have dark skin and they're oppressed because of that. They also might be a woman And again, sexism could be at play, and they're experiencing oppression or limitations in regard to their sex at birth, and potentially other things as well. But the idea that there's kind of a pile-on effect, this intersectionality of oppression that gets acted out. And I'm just going to quickly check the chat. I see that somebody typed something. We will have to reach as many people as we can. It may never end. Yeah, and that's why conversations like this, Asia, are important, because you'll go out of this conversation and you'll continue on your journey toward cultural competence, and you will impact the people you interact with. And it's interesting, and I'll touch on that again when we get to the very last bit of what we're talking about. So these are just broad categories of types of oppression: exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. And again, just keeping these broad categories in mind. So certainly historical or systematic oppression. One thing we have to really keep in mind is that impacts practices of how people are treated, policies that guide what you have access to or don't have access to, laws and standards. And again, that's the structural piece of it. And it's often referred to is that racism is baked into the system, and redlining is a perfect example of that. So we have to keep in mind historical antecedents, meaning the history that although the person sitting across from us may not have lived it, but their ancestors have. And they are potentially impacted by that history, and most likely impacted by it in some way or another. And then across structures, the idea that education, health, transportation, justice, economics, the oppression can be played out through those particular structures, and certainly at the level of institutions in terms of policies and practices. Now, this idea of internalized oppression, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a moment. I just want to ask, is anyone familiar with the black doll tests? Has anyone ever heard of that? Yeah, Roshana, Julianne, you've heard of it as well? Okay, and a number of other people are typing in the chat that they've heard of it as well. Roshana, can you say a little bit about the black doll tests, what your understanding, what you know?
From my understanding, it was giving children black dolls to see how they would react to them. It was like, I can't remember it all together because it was when I was in college, so a couple of years back. But they were giving children black dolls and seeing if they react to them versus like a fair skin doll.
Okay. Yeah, that essentially thank you, Roshana. Essentially, the way that the test was structured, and the test was done, I believe, in the 50s, and then it was done. It's been recreated a number of times, but and Asia types in, and I'll just read what you wrote, Asia. It's an experiment to see which one the child picks and why. And I have to tell you, if you've ever seen the footage from the black doll test, raise your hand. If you've ever seen the footage from it. Okay, so Juanita has, maybe Juliana, okay. Okay, yeah, if you've never seen it, I really want to encourage you to see it or revisit it if you did see it, because it's one of the most powerful examples of internalized oppression. Dolina, go ahead. I see that you have your hand up. It is hard to watch, Asia. You're absolutely right.
Well, I was just answering your question that I've seen it. I'm a older woman, so I grew up in the 60s, so I've seen it all. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Dolina. So basically, folks, what this study was is that children were shown two dolls. One was white and one was black. And they were asked, which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? And then the last question they were asked is, which doll looks like you? And it's incredibly powerful how, and these are young kids, it's incredibly powerful what they've already internalized about their own sort of identity. So to see young Black and brown kids identify the white doll as the good doll, the pretty doll, and then identify the doll that looks like them as the bad doll or the ugly doll, and then they're sort of asked which one looks like you. And it, again, if you've never seen the footage, it is hard to watch, Asia's right, but if you've never seen it, yes, and Eric, you're absolutely right. The data from those studies was used in the legal case of Brown versus Board of Education, and it helped win that case. So again, it's just a very powerful example that I'd like you to consider in regard to internalized oppression and the impact that that can actually have on an individual. So imagine if you're a child and you've already internalized that what you look like is bad and ugly, and what is good and beautiful is not what you are. And keep in mind, structural racism, systemic racism, seeks to maintain that structure. So just keeping that in mind. Yes, LaTanya, it is terrible. Terrible, absolutely horrible. Okay, so again, the person really internalizes this. And again, this idea of there are multiple, that intersectionality of racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, gender and religion oppression, all of these things, that intersectionality increasing. And again, because we're talking about cultural competence, we can't talk about internalized or structural oppression if we're not also thinking about social determinants of health. Because can you imagine if you are living with internalized depression, how that could potentially impact your health? So again, these messages that are internalized or buy-in of inferiorizing somebody, keeping them from their life goals or keeping them from feeling good about themselves, having good self-esteem or strong self-esteem. So again, probably the most basic ways to undo this kind of oppression is to intentionally forge multi-ethnic or multicultural, multilingual alliances. And this idea of getting to know people who are different than you. And being very clear about creating processes that give voice to organizational systems that share power, that don't locate power in one dominant group. And as some of you have mentioned, talking about oppression, biases, racism, it certainly brings up strong emotions. And you know, some people may have experienced that during parts of our conversation, and that's normal, that's to be expected. And when hopefully you're in other learning communities or other conversations with people, you will be able to continue this conversation and allow yourself to feel whatever you feel, and know that that's normal, and it can be part of the experience. I mentioned this yesterday, the idea of trauma informed through a cultural competence lens. And I just want to touch on this because we did talk about it yesterday. We talked about the Indian schools, and I wanted to share this picture with you because this is one school and this is one group of the hundreds of kids who were basically abducted and forced to abandon their families and their culture and their community. So the point I'd really like you to focus on in terms of this is the idea that multi-generational, the impact of trauma on multiple generations. Similarly, if we were talking about the enslavement of African-American people in this country, we would be talking about multi-generational impact of trauma. And that can actually impact and affect an individual's DNA. And that's called epigenetics. So keeping that in mind, I basically described what you're viewing here now. I described that this was kind of the process at these boarding schools. And the whole idea that the person was really stripped of, the child was stripped of their culture. And this photo, I think, really speaks to that. And it can be framed as this intentional cultural genocide. The purpose was to destroy the indigenous culture in order to control the people and force them to adopt, quote unquote, the ways of the people with power and privilege. So again, the connection of all of that. Yes, I will certainly, Juanita, I will certainly share the PowerPoint slides with the group. Yeah, as soon as we get your evaluation and we send out your certificate, we will send you the slides as well, which you are free, of course, to use any way that you would like. So in terms of trauma-informed care, I think the first thing, it has acknowledging, and this may seem absolutely basic, but that every person is a human being. And seeking to incorporate that person's culture into, and the history of that person's culture into conversations that you're having. I love this question. What were the traumas experienced by the person's immediate forebears? You don't want to assume that, but you can ask people about that. And then looking at the trauma that they've actually experienced. And again, these questions, what are some of the things that happened to you as far back as you can remember to now? And how have you been affected? Which is very different than what's wrong with you. And that's part of why trauma-informed care is so powerful. And I'm going to ask you to actually type in the chat, how many of the people that you have the opportunity to provide services to, what percentage, so 0% to 100%, what percentage of the folks that you provide services to do you think have experienced some sort of either historic and or current trauma? And just type that in the chat, the percentage. And again, let's observe what people type in. Yeah, so far I have 2 90s and 100. And again, okay, Peter says about 5%. Yeah, okay. So again, just keeping in mind the impact of trauma, historical as well as current. And this model, which I think is a really good visualization of how we can actually help clients in terms of trauma-informed care, is really recognizing cultural variations in terms of respecting and acknowledging that person's culture and understanding the roles or beliefs that they have and how they impact. One of our colleagues mentioned to us in part 1 that Western medicine was not really part of their beliefs, that herbs were something that they were using to treat themselves when they were infected with COVID. And again, we want to be understanding where people are coming from as we share information with them about choices that they can make. And again, we want to help this person to feel safe within our context. And if they're experiencing any kind of distress because of their trauma, either past or current, we want to attend to that, And then we want to work with them and their support structures in order to help them integrate the trauma and resolve it and be able to move forward. So in conclusion of our conversation today, and actually before I share this, I just want to open the door a minute for any thoughts or any reactions about historical trauma and the impact that may have. So any thoughts, any reactions to that in terms of what we just covered? And again, Rebecca, I'm wondering, could I ask you if you have any thought or any reaction to that?
To be honest with you, I have been in and out dealing with stuff and trying to take the training, so I didn't hear all.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you for being transparent, Rebecca. Greatly appreciated. Thank you. Janelle, any thoughts, any reactions to the historical trauma piece?
Oh boy, you know, in my early years of coming to the United States and having to learn the American culture, there are some things that for me, and I could be just me alone, I try not to internalize the feelings that I would get. Like I said earlier, I get angry, you know, when I see things. Yeah, and it's like, how can I just keep moving forward and have people look at me differently than what is already put out there? Because it's, and I can only talk about me, but then when I look at the actual Black Americans who have ancestors that actually went through slavery in the United States, is it my bias to say that they need to be educated enough to say, I don't want to be stereotyped, or I don't want anyone to, you know, have to make judgment of me, and I just want to keep moving in another direction where there will be the bias, like, that Black person come out of the community, you know. But for me, it's all about, I try to blank it out and just stay focused on what my life goals are. And that will be my advice to anyone else. You know, you're getting the knowledge of this information, but you know it, you're conscious of it. So therefore, no more, do better.
So the idea of accepting the history, but not letting the history crush you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
exactly.
Thank you, Janelle. And Eric, I see that your hand's up. Go ahead and unmute. I just want to read something that Tess wrote. Tess wrote, "It's disgusting, honestly, and angering." Thank you, Tess.
I just had a reaction to the last participant's statement in regards to transferring the onus for change upon those who have been impacted by the historical trauma. And I guess I come from a different point of view, that I think it's important for us to impart that change upon those who have a part in or a history of the oppressive acts and may not recognize it. What seems to be very popular in the media today and in politics is the critical race theory and whether or not it should be taught in schools.
Right.
And my own opinion is that it's a very enlightening thing. And although it may make myself feel uncomfortable about my whiteness, I think it's important that I understand it. And that doesn't make me a bad person. It makes me more understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Eric, I'm going to shorthand, I think, something that you said first, which is the idea that Black and brown people in this country didn't create racism. They didn't create that problem. White people created that problem. And that problem is still with us. And white people have to, and Eric, I really appreciate you acknowledging that, you know, hearing the history, learning the history at times can make you uncomfortable. And I think, and I'm going to speak for myself as a person, I identify as of European descent. culturally, I'm seen as a white man, and I have the privileges of a white man. And based on, what Eric was saying, the idea that, I have to be part of solving the problem. And knowing the history may make me uncomfortable, and I need to know it because it is the history. And I, as a white person, have to accept that, hey, now maybe I need to be uncomfortable about race, because Black and brown people, because of systemic racism, have been uncomfortable for hundreds of years about race. So again, I really appreciate so much and value that we're able to have this conversation, because people are risking or being willing to be uncomfortable about it. And again, that is part of the process. We all have to work together. And, I know for myself, I have to be willing to be more uncomfortable. Dolina writes, the historical trauma has affected me as an adult because I do not take the risks like my peers. I have settled with certain situations, so tired of fighting. I've seen my mother struggle for so much and for so long. Although she had 2 masters in science and 3 bachelors, it was a dang shame. However, she knew what she was up against. I sometimes come off angry, aggressive, and too dang Black. And then Dolina followed that with hell, Black power. Yeah. And again, that how could you not be angry, aggressive, if you're constantly being oppressed, discriminated against, or pushed out of having resources? That would be a normal human reaction. Just keeping that in mind. So in the last couple of minutes that we have together, I just want to share a couple of thoughts to consider as we go forward, and maybe we'll have a moment or two to let people check in about any of their experience. Again, this idea that we can choose to engage in anti-oppression, anti-racism work in order to equalize sort of power imbalances. And the thing I'd really like to point out here in terms of anti-oppressive practices is that last piece where it says in social services, it regulates any possible oppressive practices and helps in delivering services in an inclusive manner. I really love that sentence because I think it kind of lays out for us, our job is to seek out, be aware of, and regulate any possible oppressive practices so that we can deliver services in a culturally competent, inclusive way. And, to what Eric was saying about being uncomfortable, you can always ask yourself, if you're in a conversation about race, are you trying to change the subject? Are you trying to use inappropriate humor to sort of push the subject away? Or are you getting defensive or angry? Or are you going out of your way not to focus on the negative? So again, this idea, and I'm not sure if people are familiar with it, there's a great book and there's a wonderful video of the author talking about a phenomena called white fragility. And it speaks to what Eric was saying, is that white people in our culture, and again, that's a broad generalization, and I want to acknowledge that. It's a broad generalization, have for hundreds of years not been uncomfortable about race, because either they've avoided the subject or ignored it. And now there is discomfort about it because people are actually talking about it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you folks for typing your words in the chat.